Growing up in a seemingly typical suburban family, I, Elizabeth, always felt like a shadow in my own home. My older sister, Kate, was the undisputed golden child, the center of my parents' universe. From the moment I could remember, every wall in our house was a shrine to Kate's achievements, her debate trophies, academic awards, and even her college acceptance letters were displayed like priceless artifacts. Meanwhile, my accomplishments were brushed aside, as if they were insignificant footnotes in the grand narrative of Kate's life. One memory still burns vividly in my mind: my 10th birthday. While Kate was preparing for her college interviews, my parents completely forgot about my special day. In a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, they presented me with Kate's leftover graduation cake, her name still scrawled across it in bold, unapologetic letters. "We'll make it up to you next year," they said, but next year never came. Instead, it was just the beginning of a pattern that would define my childhood. Kate's needs always came first. When she made the debate team, my parents were too preoccupied with her success to notice I had made the honor roll in middle school. When I won a local painting competition in high school, they were touring college campuses with Kate, leaving me to celebrate alone in my room. Even my possessions were hand-me-downs: Kate's old violin, her outdated school supplies, and her worn-out clothes. When I asked for a properly sized violin, my mother dismissed me with a curt, "We've already spent so much on Kate's piano lessons this year." The financial disparity was glaring. Kate received private tutoring for her SATs, while I had to rely on borrowed library books. When it was time for college, my parents took out a loan to buy Kate a car, but when I needed transportation, I was told to take the bus. "We're still paying off Kate's student loans," they explained, as if my education was an afterthought. Every family decision revolved around Kate, her dreams, her needs, her future. I was the invisible sibling, the one who was always there to pick up the pieces, but never to be celebrated. The emotional toll was immense, but I learned to bury my feelings, to celebrate my victories in silence, and to accept that in my family I would always come second. Little did I know this dynamic would only intensify as we grew older, setting the stage for a lifetime of resentment and the eventual breaking point that would change everything. The unfairness that had shadowed my childhood only deepened as we grew older, solidifying into a pattern that felt inescapable. Kate's life continued to be the focal point of every family decision, while mine was relegated to the sidelines. When it came to college, my parents spared no expense for Kate, sending her to a prestigious university with their full financial backing. Meanwhile, I was told we're still paying off Kate's student loans and left to figure out how to cover the other half of my tuition at a public school. I juggled 2 part-time jobs, often falling asleep over my textbooks, while Kate breezed through her studies with the support of our parents' connections and resources. The disparity didn't end there. When Kate graduated, my parents took out another loan to buy her a car, insisting she needed it for her budding career. When I asked for help with transportation, I was met with a dismissive, "You can take the bus." It was as if my needs were an inconvenience, a burden they couldn't be bothered to shoulder. The financial favoritism was glaring, but it was the emotional toll that cut the deepest. Every family gathering, every holiday, every conversation revolved around Kate, her achievements, her plans, her dreams. My accomplishments, no matter how hard-earned, were met with a perfunctory, "That's nice, dear," before the spotlight swung back to Kate. Then came the wedding. Kate's fairy-tale nuptials were a year-long spectacle, complete with a designer gown, a lavish venue, and a guest list of over 300 people. My parents, already struggling with debt, took out yet another loan to fund it, insisting that nothing was too good for Kate's special day. I was thrust into the role of maid of honor, expected to plan bridal showers, organize a bachelorette party, and handle every last-minute crisis. When I expressed how overwhelmed I was, my mother snapped, "Don't be selfish, Elizabeth. This is your sister's time." But the final blow came when Kate announced she was expecting twins. Despite still paying off the wedding loan, my parents dipped into their retirement savings to help her buy a house near them. "This is for our grandchildren," they said, as if that justified the years of neglect I had endured. And of course, I became the default babysitter. What started as occasional favors, "Elizabeth, could you watch the boys for a few hours?" quickly escalated into a weekly obligation. My weekends were no longer my own. They belonged to Kate and her children. My tiny apartment became a chaotic playground, my time and energy drained by two energetic toddlers who seemed to have an endless supply of mischief. I tried to set boundaries, but every attempt was met with guilt trips and manipulation. "Family means sacrifice," Kate would cry, as if my life were worth less than hers. My parents echoed the sentiment, chiding me for not being supportive. I felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of their expectations. My career, my social life, my dreams all took a backseat to Kate's needs. I was no longer just Elizabeth. I was the dependable sister, the reliable aunt, the family's fallback option. And as the years went by, I began to wonder if I would ever be anything more. The breaking point came after yet another exhausting weekend babysitting Kate's twins. My apartment was in shambles, permanent marker on the couch, a broken laptop, and toys scattered everywhere. I was drained, both physically and emotionally, and I knew I needed a break. For the first time in years, I decided to prioritize myself. I found a quiet, unassuming resort in Florida, a place where I could finally breathe, relax, and reclaim some semblance of peace. It was supposed to be my escape, my chance to finally put myself first. But as soon as I mentioned my plans during a family dinner, my mother's eyes lit up with excitement. "Oh, that's perfect. We should all go together. The twins would love the beach." Before I could even protest, Kate had already started planning. "You can take the boys swimming while Jack and I have some alone time," she said, as if my vacation was naturally theirs to commandeer. My parents even offered to upgrade my reservation to a fancier resort, completely disregarding the fact that this was meant to be my time, my escape. They began organizing activities and outings centered around the twins, as if my needs and desires were irrelevant. I felt the walls closing in again, the familiar suffocation of being trapped in their expectations. But this time, something inside me snapped. I couldn't let them hijack yet another part of my life. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a decision that would change everything. I quietly booked a separate resort on a secluded island, far from the chaos of my family. I kept the change in plans a secret, meticulously preparing for my escape. I scheduled time off work, packed my bags in secret, and made sure my emergency fund was ready. It felt like planning a covert operation, but for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. The day of departure was a whirlwind of nerves and adrenaline. At the airport, I deliberately checked in at a different counter, far from where my family would be. I watched them from a distance, Kate juggling the twins, Jack checking their tickets, my parents buzzing with excitement. As they headed to their gate, I silently slipped through security for my own flight. The moment I boarded the plane, I turned off my phone, bracing myself for the inevitable fallout. The text started almost immediately. First, confusion. "Where are you?" "We're at gate B12. Then concern. "Elizabeth, is everything okay?" And finally anger. "How could you do this to us? The boys are crying." I didn't respond. For the first time in my life, I was choosing myself over their demands. As the plane took off, I felt a strange mix of liberation and guilt. But the guilt was fleeting, overshadowed by the exhilarating sense of freedom. I was finally breaking free from the chains of my family's expectations, and nothing, not their anger, not their guilt trips, could stop me now. The moment I landed on the secluded island, I turned my phone back on, bracing myself for the storm I knew was coming. What greeted me was nothing short of chaos over 300 text messages, 147 missed calls, and dozens of voicemails. My family had discovered my absence, and their reactions were as explosive as I had feared. The texts ranged from bewildered, "Where are you?" "We're at gate B12, to frantic, "Elizabeth, is something wrong? Are you okay?" And finally, furious, "How could you do this to us? The boys are inconsolable." My mother had even called my workplace, claiming there was a family emergency, but thankfully, I had warned my boss in advance. Listening to the voicemails was like riding an emotional roller coaster. My mother's tone shifted from concern to rage to outright manipulation. Elizabeth, how could you abandon your family like this? Did we raise you to be so selfish? She demanded, her voice trembling with anger. Kate's messages were even worse, dripping with guilt and accusation. You've ruined everything. The boys keep asking for Aunt Lizzie, and I can't handle this on my own. She cried as if my absence was the ultimate betrayal. Even Jack chimed in, his voice strained with frustration. I had to cut meetings short because of this. You've really put us in a bind. But it was my father's message that caught me off guard. For the first time in my life, he sounded unsure, almost vulnerable. Elizabeth, please let us know you're safe. I don't understand what's happening, but I just need to know you're okay. His words struck a chord, stirring a mix of guilt and sadness. For years, he had been complicit in the family's favoritism, but now, there was a flicker of something different, a hint of recognition, perhaps that I was more than just Kate's sister. Despite the emotional turmoil, I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. For the first time in years, I was free from the constant demands and expectations. The guilt was there. Of course, it had been ingrained in me for decades, but it was overshadowed by the exhilarating feeling of putting myself first. I sent a single text to the family group chat. I'm safe and enjoying my vacation. I'll reach out when I'm back. Please respect my space. Then I turned off my phone again, determined to savor every moment of my hard-earned freedom. The next few days were transformative. I tried surfing for the first time, joined a yoga class by the beach, and even had a spontaneous dinner date with a charming stranger I met at the resort. Each experience felt like a small rebellion against the life I had left behind. The weight of years of suppressed emotions began to lift, replaced by a newfound sense of self-worth. I realized that I wasn't just escaping a vacation, I was escaping a lifetime of being taken for granted. And for the first time, I felt truly alive. The day of reckoning came sooner than I expected. After my transformative vacation, I knew I couldn't return to the same toxic dynamic. I chose a neutral coffee shop for the confrontation, a place where I could maintain some control over the situation. I arrived early, my hands trembling as I clutched my coffee cup, rehearsing the words I had practiced countless times. My family arrived together, my parents, Kate, and even Jack, who rarely involved himself in these matters. The tension was palpable, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Before they could launch into their usual guilt trips, I took a deep breath and began. I'm setting boundaries, and they're non-negotiable, I declared, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. What followed was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Kate immediately burst into tears, painting herself as the victim. The twins were devastated without you. How could you abandon them like this? She sobbed, as if my absence had scarred them for life. My mother jumped in, her voice sharp with accusation. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? Family means sacrifice, Elizabeth. Jack, surprisingly, tried to mediate, suggesting a compromise where I would only babysit every other weekend. But even his attempt at reason felt like another way to control me. My father sat quietly, his expression unreadable, but I could see the discomfort in his eyes. It was Kate's final blow that shattered whatever remained of my patience. You're being selfish, she spat, her tears drying as her anger flared. Family means sacrifice, and you're failing us. Something inside me snapped. For the first time, I didn't hold back. Yes, family means sacrifice, I shot back, my voice rising. But it's supposed to go both ways. When was the last time any of you sacrificed anything for me? The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air like a guillotine. I laid it all out, the years of being overlooked, the financial favoritism, the emotional neglect. I even showed them my calendar, every weekend marked with babysitting duties, every holiday tailored to their needs. My mother tried to interrupt, her voice shrill. But that's what aunts do! She protested as if my entire existence was meant to serve Kate's family. I didn't hold back. No, that's what paid babysitters do, I retorted. And, Kate, if you need this much help, maybe it's time to hire one. The room erupted into chaos. Kate stormed out, my mother trailing behind her, while Jack stayed behind, offering a rare apology. We've taken advantage of you, he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. My father, for the first time, seemed to truly see me. We never meant to make you feel this way, he said, though it wasn't quite an apology. As they left, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. I had finally stood up for myself, but the battle was far from over. I knew this was just the beginning of a long journey to reclaim my life, but for the first time, I felt like I had the strength to see it through. After the explosive confrontation with my family, I knew I couldn't return to the life I had been living. The coffee shop showdown was a turning point, but it was only the beginning. I needed to make drastic changes to truly reclaim my life. The first step was to move. I found a small, cozy apartment in a different part of the city, far from the chaos of my family's constant demands. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine, a sanctuary where I could finally breathe. I changed my phone number, cutting off the endless stream of guilt-tripping texts and calls. Only my workplace and a handful of trusted friends had the new number. It felt like shedding an old skin, one that had been suffocating me for years. The next step was to rebuild my life from the ground up. For the first time, I allowed myself to explore hobbies and interests that had always been pushed aside. I signed up for a pottery class, something I'd always wanted to try but never had the time for. The first time I sat at the wheel, my hands trembling as I shaped the clay, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't known in years. It was messy and imperfect, but it was mine. I also joined a local book club, where I met people who valued my thoughts and opinions, not just my ability to babysit or solve family crises. Dating was another frontier I decided to explore, albeit cautiously. I went on a few casual dates, savoring the freedom to connect with someone without the weight of family obligations hanging over me. One evening, I even had a spontaneous dinner with a man I met at a coffee shop. It wasn't anything serious, but it reminded me that I was more than just the family's fallback option. I was a person with my own desires and dreams. Work also became a source of fulfillment rather than just a means to an end. Without the constant interruptions from my family, I was able to focus and excel in my role. My boss noticed the change and assigned me to lead a major new project, a responsibility I embraced with confidence. For the first time in years, I felt like I was thriving, not just surviving. The most profound change, however, was internal. The constant background anxiety that had plagued me for years began to fade. I started exercising regularly, eating better, and even sleeping through the night. I began therapy, where I unpacked years of emotional baggage and learned to set healthy boundaries. My therapist called it post-traumatic growth, and I could feel it happening slowly but surely. My new apartment became a reflection of my newfound independence. The walls were adorned with my pottery creations and photos of my chosen family friends who respected my boundaries and celebrated my achievements. I even hosted a small housewarming party, inviting only those who truly supported me. It was a far cry from the chaotic family gatherings I had grown accustomed to, and it felt like a fresh start. For the first time in my life, I was living for myself, not for the expectations of others. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt and guilt, but I knew I was on the right path. I was no longer just Elizabeth, the dependable sister, or the reliable aunt. I was Elizabeth, the woman who had finally chosen herself. After I set my boundaries and moved into my new apartment, the fallout from my family was both expected and relentless. My mother and Kate in particular doubled down on their attempts to manipulate me, refusing to accept that I was no longer willing to play the role of the family's sacrificial lamb. My mother's tactics were a mix of guilt-tripping and outright anger. She left voicemails that ranged from tearful pleas. "Elizabeth, how could you do this to us? We're your family," to outright rage. "You're tearing this family apart with your selfishness." She even tried to rally other relatives against me, spreading stories that I was having a breakdown and needed an intervention. It was exhausting, but for the first time, I didn't let it break me. Kate, on the other hand, took a more passive-aggressive approach, She flooded social media with posts about selfish sisters and broken families, clearly aimed at me. She even showed up at my workplace unannounced, demanding to talk. Thankfully, I had warned security about the possibility, and they escorted her out. Her messages became increasingly desperate, alternating between anger and guilt. "The twins miss you so much," she wrote, attaching a photo of them looking sad. "How can you abandon them like this?" But I held firm, reminding myself that I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was simply choosing myself for once. The most surprising development came from my father. After weeks of silence, he reached out, asking if we could meet for lunch. I was hesitant, but something in his tone felt different. When we sat down at a quiet cafe near my office, he seemed uneasy, almost nervous. "You look healthier," he began, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Happier." It was the first time he had ever acknowledged my well-being without immediately deflecting to Kate. As we talked, I opened up about the years of feeling invisible, the unfair treatment, and the emotional toll it had taken on me. To my shock, he really listened. "We thought we were doing what was best for the family," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But we never realized how much we were hurting you." It wasn't a full apology, but it was the first time he had ever acknowledged the imbalance in our family dynamic. The conversation was a turning point, but it didn't come without consequences. When my mother and Kate found out about our meeting, they were furious. My mother accused him of betraying the family, while Kate lashed out, claiming I was poisoning him against her. But for the first time, my father didn't immediately defend them. Instead, he seemed to be grappling with the reality of what our family had become. While my mother and Kate continued their attempts to manipulate me, I felt a newfound strength. Their words no longer had the same power over me. I had built a life outside of their expectations, and I was determined to protect it. My father's tentative understanding gave me hope that, someday, the rest of my family might see me for who I truly was, not just as Kate's sister, but as Elizabeth, a person deserving of love, respect, and freedom. The changes in my life over the past few months have been nothing short of transformative. For the first time in years, I feel a sense of lightness and happiness that I didn't think was possible. The constant weight of guilt and obligation that had been crushing me for decades has finally lifted, replaced by a newfound sense of freedom and self-worth. My career, once a source of stress and exhaustion, has become a place of growth and fulfillment. Without the constant interruptions from my family, I've been able to focus and excel in my role. My boss recently assigned me to lead a major new project, a responsibility I embraced with confidence and enthusiasm. It was a stark contrast to the years I spent turning down opportunities, because they might conflict with my family's demands. My personal life has also blossomed in ways I never imagined. I've thrown myself into new hobbies, like pottery and hiking, and joined a local book club where I've made genuine connections with people who value me for who I am, not what I can do for them. I've even started dating again, taking things slow with someone who respects my boundaries and celebrates my independence. It's a far cry from the life I used to lead, where my weekends were consumed by babysitting and my social life was non-existent. Now I spend my free time exploring my passions, building meaningful relationships, and simply enjoying the freedom to be myself. The most profound change, however, has been internal. The constant background anxiety that used to plague me has faded, replaced by a sense of peace and contentment. I've started therapy where I've been unpacking years of emotional baggage and learning to set healthy boundaries. My therapist calls it post-traumatic growth, and I can feel it happening slowly but surely. I am sleeping better, eating healthier, and taking care of myself in ways I never did before. For the first time, I understand that putting myself first isn't selfish, it's necessary for a balanced and happy life. As for my family, the future remains uncertain. My mother and Kate continue to struggle with my newfound independence, alternating between angry outbursts and icy silence. My father, however, has shown glimmers of understanding, and his tentative support has given me hope that someday the rest of my family might see me for who I truly am. But I've stopped waiting for their approval. I've built a life that doesn't revolve around their expectations, and I'm determined to protect it. Looking ahead, I know there will be challenges. My family's attempts to manipulate me may not stop, and the guilt still surfaces from time to time. But I've learned to navigate those feelings, reminding myself that I deserve to live a life that's true to me. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with my family, but I do know this. I'm no longer willing to sacrifice my happiness for their comfort. I'm choosing myself every single day, and for the first time in my life, I feel truly free. This isn't just an ending, it's a new beginning, and I can't wait to see where it takes me.